Okay, so in the previous video, I had started to build up the Solo Growth model, which I haven't erased here. And we talked about how this is the savings as a percent, let's say 20% times your total income. Here's my total income, and here's my depreciation. This point right here would be useful to call our steady state equilibrium. This would be where savings is exactly equal to depreciation. And I ended the last video by basically saying what happens when we're here versus what happens when we're here. Well, what happens, essentially, is that what we can see, for instance, right here, is that the savings exceeds the depreciation. So we're saving more than it's being worn out. Well, what would tend to happen? The total capital stock would tend to increase because we're saving more than it's being destroyed, which would mean that we'd start to head in that direction. So savings is greater than depreciation. And we move to that equilibrium without doing anything different. Versus over here in scenario number 2, where depreciation is greater than savings. In a situation where depreciation is greater than savings, well, what happens then is it starts to fall. So it's being worn out faster. And you can see why that's then a steady state. Without anyone changing anything, this would be the long-run capital stock per worker, and this would be the long-run income per worker. But now we can change things around, right? The one thing that we just talked about in the previous video is that we could change technology, right? And we could shift up this function, which would also shift up the savings function. Now the steady state would be way out here, and now income would be higher, right? So one way that we can encourage economic growth is by encouraging technology. Now what else could we do? Well, we could, instead of changing the production function with technology, we could simply just try to encourage people to save more and just change the savings function. We do that right now with tax policy, for instance, right? We try to encourage people to save for retirement in an attempt to allow there to be the capital or savings so that it can then be invested and exceed the depreciation rate. Now, what's going on here then is you have an economy then that to achieve long-run economic growth requires a balance between savings, and creating financial markets to distribute that savings to those who want to borrow the capital. And that capital is, of course, being worn out a little bit over time. But the one thing I said in the previous part of this video is that Solo Growth model depends critically on labor productivity. Workers need to be productive in order to encourage economic growth. The way that they're becoming more productive is by having more technology and more capital. Now, one of the important things, though, that I looked, that happened essentially, what would it be now? I guess about 30 years ago, certainly before my time, was that there was a dramatic decrease. Starting 30 years ago, there was a dramatic decrease up until 1995. So basically in the early part of all of our lives, there was a significant decrease in worker productivity. Now that would be important for this Solo Growth model, right? Because that would imply that we're not going to have as much savings per worker and not as much capital investment. Now, this productivity slowdown was quite significant. Productivity was increasing at a rate about half of what it used to be increasing. So it used to increase about 2% a year, which would mean that would be a large part of the way that we get economic growth, and instead it was only a fraction over 1%. By the way, we should all be proud of ourselves. We have among other countries in the world the highest labor productivity, so we should all pat ourselves on the back. But between 1973 and 95, worker productivity had dramatically fallen. And so economists have been actually looking a great deal at why that was the case. There are three general reasons why economists believe that productivity slowed down so much in that time period. There's one issue which says that it was falling education standards. So workers were essentially becoming stupider because the education system wasn't training them well, and as a result they weren't able to work well with technology. A second reason is an idea that during the energy crises with the oil embargoes, workers were being organized in the production in a way that saved on energy, but didn't necessarily make them more productive. So the instance here would be, I could be a productive worker if I had two computers running, right? Because I could have one converting videos and I could be making a video. But to save electricity, what if I was required to have only one computer or share it, right? I certainly am saving energy, but I'm not as productive. And I'm forced to not be as productive because of the energy costs. That has some credibility, much more so at least than the education one. Perhaps the reason that's actually given the most credibility is the idea that we just weren't measuring things right. Remember, in this time, in the 73 to 95 time period, we were producing much more services rather than goods. And it's harder to measure the production of services rather than goods. So it actually just might mean that we didn't measure things correctly, right? I deliver a service, education, research. It's really hard to measure because in an average year, I produce one research paper a year. You can quantify it as a research paper, but it's really hard to see what's all in it and what went into making it. Well, all these bookcases were required to create that input. And even in terms of classes, you can count the number of students I teach. But we know that in terms of delivering a service, right, different professors perform better or worse than others. And so as a result, it's hard to measure the quality of the education service I'm delivering. Although some of you may think it's an incredibly low quality service. We're past the refund time though, so you can't get your money back. Okay. So the final thing I want to cover for this chapter is this idea of the convergence theory. So the idea is that different countries of the world are growing at different paces. And there's this theory called the convergence theory, which basically says that in the long run, over the long run, all economies will end up growing at exactly the same pace. And the reason why is, let's say I had $1,000. I wish. If I had $1,000, right, I could look at the interest rates that are being paid around the world. And I could see that I could get a really high interest rate if I was willing to, let's say, invest in a developing country, like Mongolia. Mongolia has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, a stock market that was of the top 5 performers last year. So if I have extra money, should I be investing in Mongolia? Well, I don't. The reason why I don't, right? Well, I guess let's put it this way. What the convergence theory would say is that individuals looking only at the interest rate would tend to put it in developing economies, right? Like a Mongolia example, and that Mongolia would then use that capital to then start to grow faster, and eventually they would become a developed economy. Well, why doesn't that happen? Well, it doesn't happen because developing economies, going back to the first part of this lecture, have a different set of institutions. So it's not just the interest rate that I care about. I care about the larger institutional structure. And because the government is more likely to just take money and to take property, I'm unwilling to invest in those countries. Why is a country like Africa perpetually poor? Although the interest rates and the rate of return on an investment might be higher in Africa, it's more likely that your property will not be returned to you. The institutional infrastructure is underdeveloped. And so as a result, only those who are incredibly risky with their money are willing to invest in those countries. But they have an incredibly hard time getting more capital. Okay, that finishes this lecture and finishes your solo growth model, your very first macroeconomic model.